Imagine you're in the trenches of World War I. You've somehow survived the battles, you've made it through terrifying raids into no man's land, but something is deeply, terribly wrong. You're trembling uncontrollably. You can't see. You can't even remember your own name. And the thing is, there's no physical wound. But you are, without a doubt, a casualty of war. This was the terrifying reality for countless soldiers. So today, we're gonna dive into this mysterious condition that didn't just haunt the trenches, but actually changed our world: shell shock.
I mean, this quote just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's the central paradox that doctors, generals, and families were all grappling with. How could a soldier be completely unharmed on the outside, yet so utterly broken on the inside? That was the impossible question behind shell shock.
And that leads us right into our first section, the unseen wound of war. Now look, the psychological terror of combat, that's as old as war itself. But the Great War, World War I, it unleashed that terror on a scale that was completely, totally unprecedented. It gave an ancient horror a new and unforgettable name. So the term itself, shell shock, was first used in 1915. You have to understand it was basically a catch-all phrase for this whole host of baffling symptoms that doctors were seeing in soldiers who had no visible injuries whatsoever. It was a massive medical mystery unfolding right in the middle of the world's most brutal war. And when you look at the symptoms, wow, the range was just staggering. We're talking everything from debilitating headaches and irregular heartbeats to sudden blindness, total amnesia, and just crippling anxiety and depression. These weren't minor complaints, you know? These were life-shattering conditions that completely defied any easy explanation. But here's the thing. This kind of trauma wasn't exactly new. The terror of battle has always left these unseen scars. We see it talked about in ancient epics like Gilgamesh. During the Napoleonic Wars, they had a name for it: bullet wind. In the American Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. Each name described a very similar kind of suffering. What made World War I different was the industrial scale of the warfare, which in turn created an industrial scale of trauma. And to put that scale into perspective, get this. In the British Army alone, an estimated 80,000 soldiers were officially diagnosed with shell shock. 80,000. That number represents entire divisions worth of men, casualties in every sense of the word. It forced the authorities to confront a crisis they were completely and totally unprepared for. So, of course, this massive crisis led to a huge debate, which brings us to our next section. Was shell shock a physical injury to the brain, or was it a psychological wound of the mind? The answer to that question would have massive implications for everyone: the soldiers, the doctors, and the governments paying the bills. So yeah, what was causing these invisible wounds? That was the question on everyone's mind. Everybody agreed the symptoms were real, they were devastating, but what was the root cause? The entire medical establishment was basically divided, just scrambling to understand what was going on. Okay, so the debate basically boiled down to two main camps. On the one hand, you had the physical theory. These folks argued that the sheer concussive force of exploding shells was causing tiny, invisible lesions on the brain. But on the other hand, the psychological theory argued that the trauma was really an internal conflict, a battle between a soldier's natural fear and his drilled-in sense of duty. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some academic debate. Oh no. Accepting a psychological cause could open the floodgates for massive pension claims, a cost that governments were absolutely desperate to avoid. Well, all this confusion over what was actually causing it led to some, let's just say, drastic and conflicting ideas about treatment. And that brings us to our next section, the desperate cures, which swung wildly from outright brutality to surprising empathy. I mean, you really had two completely opposite philosophies clashing here. On one side, some doctors saw shell shock as a failure of will, right? A disciplinary problem that needed a harsh physical solution to snap the soldier out of it. On the other side, a different group of doctors saw a deep emotional wound that could only be healed through understanding and compassion. Let's start with one of the most brutal methods, something called Faradism. Here's how it worked. A soldier, who is often accused of faking his symptoms, would have powerful electric currents applied directly to his body. The goal wasn't really healing, it was intimidation. The hope was that the fear of the treatment would be even greater than the fear of the trenches, and it would force the soldier back to the front line. And if you want to know just how horrific this treatment was, just listen to this quote from a French soldier. He said the shock was strong enough to move a streetcar. Think about that for a second. The experience was so terrifying, he would rather be court-martialed and possibly executed than ever go through it again. But, and this is a big but, it was a totally different approach gaining ground, thank goodness.
Pioneered by doctors like W.H.R. Rivers, the talking cure was based on empathy, not punishment. The idea here was revolutionary for its time. It was that the trauma came from repressed memories, from that internal war between fear and duty. And by helping a soldier actually talk through these horrific experiences, a therapist could help him find peace.
And this debate, it wasn't just happening in a medical journal. It was an international issue. And how each country responded to the crisis of shell shock, well, it tells you a whole lot about their wartime priorities, and even their national culture.
You can really see three totally different mindsets here. In Germany, the main concern was economic. To avoid paying out pensions, they pushed for work therapy to get men back into the wartime economy. In France, the core belief was that it was a failure of will, which led to those brutal frontline treatments designed to just force soldiers back into the fight. But in Britain, there was a growing acceptance of the psychological cause, and that led to the creation of specialized hospitals and those talking cures we just talked about.
And here's a fascinating statistic out of Britain that really turned a lot of assumptions on their head. As this chart shows, officers were, percentage-wise, more likely to suffer from shell shock than enlisted men. The theory was that officers felt that conflict between their duty to their men and their own personal fear even more acutely. The single fact was a powerful argument against the idea that shell shock was just a condition of the weak or the cowardly. So, after all this suffering, all this debate, what's the takeaway? What's the lasting legacy? Well, as we're about to see in our final section, the struggle to even understand shell shock ended up having a profound and lasting impact that changed how we think about the mind forever. When you boil it all down, the legacy of shell shock fundamentally changed our entire understanding of mental health in three huge ways. First, it proved that extreme circumstances, not just some kind of weak character, could cause a mental breakdown in anyone. Second, it challenged the old idea that mental illness was a permanent life sentence, showing it could actually be a temporary condition. And finally, it slowly began to reduce the stigma, making psychological causes more acceptable and normalizing psychotherapy, or the talking cure. In the end, shell shock was so much more than just a medical diagnosis. It became a powerful metaphor for the entire war, a trauma so deep that its recurring nightmares didn't just haunt the soldiers who survived, they haunted the entire world that emerged from the trenches. It forced us all to confront the unseen wounds of war, and honestly, we are still learning its lessons today.